Still remember the smell of toner and lukewarm coffee the morning it started. I worked in a small product team at a mid-sized software company. 8 of us, cubicles in a row, the usual mix of quiet grinders and noisy problem solvers. Our manager, Mark, had been promoted from senior dev to people manager the previous year. He was the sort of boss who loved rules the way some people love rock music. Loudly and with conviction. Not all rules were bad. We had release protocols, QA checklists, and a handful of security steps that actually mattered. But Mark's relationship with rules was performative. He treated them like trophies. Meetings opened with slide decks stacked with process screenshots. Every email had an attached checklist. He would call out colleagues in full team meetings for the smallest paperwork mistakes, like a teacher humiliates a student for forgetting a comma. I'm not the type to make waves. I knew the code, hit my deadlines, and kept my head down. But the culture changed the day he exploded at Josh. Our junior dev Josh had missed one tiny field on an internal compliance form. An oversight, nothing catastrophic. Mark shouted, right there, in front of everyone. "You put us all at risk," he said, voice echoing across the open floor. He printed the form, highlighted the missing field in red, and made Josh stand while he read out the exact clause from the policy manual. People shifted and stared. Someone tried to joke, but it landed flat. Josh's face went white. I felt embarrassed for him and stupidly angry at how Mark framed power as moral superiority. After the meeting, we filed back into our chairs. Josh closed his laptop and looked like he might leave. Instead, he opened a new document and started listing every process step we were supposed to follow, verbatim, with timestamps. I watched him, curious. Over the next few days, he refined that document. People began to murmur. It felt like a small thing then, a junior employee deciding to be extra careful. I didn't expect that document to become a weapon, but it did. And that weapon would reshape our team faster than any talk about morale ever could. Once the fear of the public scolding wore off, something quieter settled over us, a shift toward literalism. Mark's message had been simple. Rules are rules, and anyone who breaks them weakens the team. The natural response, for many of us, was to comply. But Josh and a few others read his punishment differently. If you want us to treat rules like sacred law, fine. We'll treat them like sacred law. It started with forms. Where previously a one-line note in an email sufficed for minor approvals, people began to attach the full documentation. Signed PDFs, screenshots of individual checkbox completions, and annotated timestamps. Approvals that used to take an afternoon now went through formal portals with timeouts and autologs. I was the quiet, methodical type, and at first I rationalized these behaviors as protective. Double-checking saved mistakes. Then came the escalation. Our internal change request process required a certain review path. Dev, QA, product, security, usually an email ping between folks. We began to use the official change portal because that satisfied the literal letter of company policy. The portal demanded steps most of us hadn't used in months. Risk assessments, rollback plans, code swim lanes, dependency matrices. Every field demanded attachments. For a small bug fix that used to be a 2-hour task, we had to write a 1-page risk summary and wait for 2 sign-offs. I found myself adding screenshots and legalese to satisfy the new ritual. The beautiful, infuriating thing was that we weren't breaking rules anymore. We were following them so precisely that the rules became friction. Deadlines that once felt like promises now moved like loose sand. Clients noticed delays. Managers above Mark demanded explanations. I watched Mark grow increasingly frantic, as if his sermon had accidentally conjured a force he couldn't control. He doubled down with memos, clearer checklists, stricter timing windows, mandatory daily stand-up forms. The more he pushed, the more strictly we complied. I started to realize the revenge prototype unfolding. Weaponize the thing he used to humiliate us, his love of process, and let it strangle the system he believed in. We had meetings about meeting culture. HR stepped in twice to mediate communication concerns. In private, some coworkers admitted their motives. If Mark wanted obedience on the surface, they'd give it to him. Exactly, meticulously, and only to the point that it caused operational pain. There was no scheme to derail the company or hurt people. The plan was petty, banal, and clinical. Follow every rule, document everything, and stop the reflexive shortcuts that had always kept our velocity alive. It felt clean and righteous in a way that surprised me, like aligning tiny dominoes. I began cataloging our processes as a kind of map. Which step added days? Which approval was rarely productive? Where did the portal introduce mandatory fields with no real-world value? I made a spreadsheet, old habits die hard, and started tracking average approval times for routine tasks. Where we once had an informal fast lane email path, there now stood an official queue. The fast lane still existed in whispers, but people were too nervous to use it. I added notes about how each form could be made complete to avoid Mark's attention. Include screenshots, attach the test report, reference the policy clause number. The irony, by doing extra work to obey the rules, we shortened our personal fear of public reprimand, but lengthened the company's timelines. There were ethical murmurs. A senior teammate, Lena, argued that this was sabotage, that delayed releases hurt clients and could jeopardize jobs. Another colleague countered that Mark's management style had already harmed people more than a missed deadline ever could. The conversation never reached a consensus. Instead, it revealed how fractured trust had become. For me, the calculus was simple. We were treated like children in public and adults in private. The only language Mark seemed to understand seemed to be numbers and consequences. If the rules he loved could produce consequences he did not want, maybe that would teach him restraint. Execution was quieter than I expected. There wasn't a dramatic meeting where we plotted revenge. Mostly, it was a series of small, obedient choices made by people tired of being humiliated. One Tuesday, we delayed a build because the portal required an extra security sign-off that came from a team in another time zone. The sign-off itself was harmless, but the portal's validation required an attached proof of test that needed our QA lead to run a longer test suite. The test took 2 extra days. We followed every instruction on the checklist. We copied the full transcripts into the request. We labeled everything with policy clause numbers. It felt absurd and slightly liberating. As the delays compounded, clients began to email. The upper managers asked for status reports. Mark's responses were defensive memos full of process rhetoric. "We are following company policy," he wrote. He framed the delays as necessary diligence. He didn't see, or refused to see, that his insistence on public shaming had created a culture that weaponized compliance. He doubled down with a new set of directives. No more verbal approvals, no exceptions. That was the trigger for the next wave of literalism. We obeyed, and obedience, oddly, became an edge tool. Where previously a polite nudge could expedite a task, we now routed everything through the portal and required every attachment listed in the manual. One of our biggest releases, a minor feature for a key client, got pushed by 2 weeks. The client called. The conversation was tense. My inbox filled with, "Why is this delayed?" messages. I wrote a careful, documented reply, timelines, the exact policy flow we followed, timestamps of approvals, and the attached test logs. I CC'd Mark. I was doing my job and also providing evidence. It felt petty when I thought of it that way, but there was a correctness to it. If the process was the law, then let the law be visible. Let the cost be visible. The fallout came in layers. Upper management convened a post-mortem meeting with slides that tried to be neutral but read like blame poetry. They wanted root causes. They wanted to know why a routine sprint had become a slow crawl. We presented our timelines, our logs, and the portal history. The data was unforgiving. Approval time spiked after Mark's public reprimand. The compliance fields that had been optional returned to life and demanded attention. I watched the room shift as senior leaders read the timestamps. Quiet, uncomfortable, the kind of silence that feels like a vote. HR recommended managerial coaching for Mark and a review of our change management practices. Mark reacted as if he had been stabbed. He accused the team of deliberately subverting the process. In his version, we were insubordinate, and any delay was a personal attack. Our documented history argued otherwise. We had followed the rules to the letter. The irony tasted metallic on my tongue. In the weeks that followed, Mark's authority dwindled. He was enrolled in mandatory leadership training. He stopped doing public callouts in the open office, at least for a while. The company also instituted a review of which process steps were actually necessary for small changes. There was no dramatic firing, no heroism. The system resolved itself in meetings and memos and soft transitions. Some people left, others stayed. Our releases resumed a more reasonable cadence after some process pruning. But not everything went back to how it had been. Trust, once broken, didn't repair overnight. Mark remained defensive, and I could sense a new caution whenever he zipped open an email. We had won a kind of justice, but it was tainted. Clients had to be appeased, and the team had to shoulder reputational cost. The revenge had worked in a narrow sense. It exposed a toxicity, but it also forced everyone to deal with the fallout of being literal. I still wrestle with what we did. On paper, we were obedient employees. In practice, our obedience had the shape of retaliation. There are nights I replay episodes and wonder if there was a better path. Could we have raised the issue earlier? Could we have asked for private feedback instead of letting humiliation fester into a tacit plan? Maybe. But the truth is that humiliation changes the rules you play by. When your manager chooses ritualized public shaming as a tool, it distorts incentives. People start optimizing for safety, not speed. They trade creativity for compliance. They end up weaponizing the very norms meant to keep everyone aligned. A friend who leads another department told me his team handles similar problems differently. Direct feedback loops, anonymous escalation, and a culture that values private correction. What we lacked wasn't rules. It was grace. If someone makes a mistake, correcting it privately preserves dignity and prevents the incentive calculus we fell into. But once dignity is lost, people get inventive. Obedience can become a protest when it's used as a mirror to reflect a manager's worst behavior. We made rules into a mirror, and the reflection was ugly. I learned things I didn't expect. I learned the power of documentation and how transparency can protect people and expose systems. I learned how small acts of compliance, when coordinated, can create systemic consequences. I also learned the limits of revenge. It felt good in moments, watching Mark stumble with his own constructs, but it also made me complicit in long meetings and angry calls with clients. There's a moral vagueness to that. I'm not proud of every choice we made, but I don't regret standing up, even if it was indirect. Standing up took a form that fit the tools we had: paperwork, timestamps, and a refusal to let shame be the only lever in the room. Today I write this as a cautionary note more than a victory lap. The team is different now. Some of us moved on, some stayed, and the company introduced clearer distinctions between mandatory security steps and managerial preferences. Mark is still there in some capacity, quieter, I think, but the culture shifted enough that no one feels the impulse to humiliate publicly like that anymore. We did something crude. We used his weapon against him. Changed things. It made them better in some ways and worse in others. If I could give advice to managers reading this, it would be simple. Public shaming is short-sighted. It builds compliance that is brittle and invites gaming. If you want people to own processes, model patience and correct errors privately. If you're a colleague watching someone get called out, speak up. The cost of silence can be higher than you think. And if you're someone who's been humiliated, know this. You can respond without becoming cruel. We chose a quiet, procedural revenge. It wasn't noble, but it was effective. The company fixed some processes and punished no one dramatically. The moral lesson was diffuse and slow. I don't tell this story to celebrate the delays or to clap for headaches we caused. I tell it because power dynamics in offices are subtle and easily weaponized. Rules are necessary, but they deserve to be wielded with humility. When they aren't, the people who know how to follow them to the letter can end up saving their dignity in the most literal way, by holding processes accountable until the system unravels enough to force change.